Hello and welcome. I'm your host and moderator, Simone Chun. Thank you for taking the time to join us today for the webinar, Axis of War, the Japan-Korea-US Trilateral Alliance. As you know, the Biden administration is determined to formalize Washington's long-pursued military alliance with Japan and South Korea for the ostensible pretext of enhancing deterrence and cooperation against North Korea and China. Today, the first Japan-Korea-US Trilateral Summit is taking place at Camp David amid the deployment of US nuclear assets to the Korean Peninsula and Washington's steady military encirclement of China. The summit is expected to formalize regular trilateral war games, missile defense integration, and the creation of an anti-China economic bloc as a part of Washington's hegemonic quest for a US-led unipolar world. The impending trilateral militaristic axis is dangerous, provocative, and fuels the rising danger of war in the Asia-Pacific. What is the historical and geopolitical context behind this dangerous trilateral militarism? How will it impact the Korean Peninsula? At the end of today's webinar, we will learn that this formal new military arrangement, long desired by Washington's security community, will only exacerbate military tensions in the region and increase the risk of a renewed conflict and a potentially catastrophic nuclear war. Before we get started, I'd like to go over just a few items so that you know how to participate in today's event. A simultaneous English to Korean translation is available for Korean native speakers, thanks to our translator, Eunji Kang. Our meeting will last about 90 minutes and will end with a Q&A session, and the program will be live cast on Zoom and YouTube. I would like now first introduce our distinguished panelist. Cathi Choi is the Director of Policy and Organizing for Women Curse DMZ, a global movement of activists mobilizing to end Korean War, reunite families, and ensure feminist leadership in peace building. She coordinates the Korea Peace Now grassroots network launched in 2019 to organize communities in calling for demilitarization and lasting peace on the Korean Peninsula. Thanks, Cathi, for joining us today. Alexis Dudden is a professor of history at the University of Connecticut and world-renowned East Asian historian. She focused her research in modern Northeast Asia during and after Japanese imperialist rule and has a keen interest in contemporary Northeast Asian relations. In 2015, Professor Dudden led 187 historians from around the world to issue a statement opposing the Abe administration's distortion of history. She was awarded the Manhe Peace Prize in 2015 for her efforts to establish an accurate, just view of history globally. One of her key works is Japan's colonization of Korea, Discourse and Power. Thanks for joining us, Alexis. Tim Shorrock is a Washington-based investigative journalist who grew up in Japan and South Korea and has lived in DC since 1983. He's the author of Spies for Hire, The Secret World of Outsourcing Intelligence, and is currently working on DMZ Empire, his second book. He manages a website, Patreon, a multimedia platform for 60 plus years of Tim's reporting on US intervention in Korea and Japan and American foreign policy in Asia. Thanks, Tim, for joining us tonight. The order of today's seminar will be as follows. We'll first have Professor Dudden's talk, and followed by Tim Shorrock and Cathi Choi. And without further ado, let us turn to Professor Dudden.
I don't have a formal talk, and I want to thank everybody for taking time this morning in Korea, this evening or this afternoon in the United States or wherever anybody might be. I don't think it's a bad day I think what's really interesting today is that the Camp David summit, nobody cares about. And when I say no one cares about, I have been spending days looking, as I'm sure all of us have, looking at who's reporting on this. The New York Times is very excited about it. The Washington Post, it's still not even a banner headline. CNN doesn't care. It's buried. Why? Because Americans don't understand, have not been introduced to what is happening. And I say that because what is really terrible in all of this, it's not just that more weapons are going to be sold. There will be no peace. That there will be no learning from what is happening. And so this is supposed to be a done deal, chunk, chunk, chunk. Is it for the Biden administration? It could be for any American president administration. And the two things I would like to introduce are the racisms involved, just sort of the inherent racism of not understanding, and that Americans don't need to care because, and by Americans in that sentence, that's also a racist sentence. By Americans, white Americans just think, oh, Japan and Korea, who cares? It's over there. And I say that because I am astonished at the bipolarity, and I mean no disrespect to the disorder, but the disjunct between how much press this summit is gaining in Japan, South Korea, North Korea, China, and how little press is happening in the US. I mean, I could walk out my front door and nobody would know this was happening. And I say that because that's the problem. Americans are ignorant of what's at stake right now. Even though I live 10 miles from the defense plant that will be building the nuclear submarines that are part of some of the contracts that were agreed to today. And so, you know, this is for Americans, it's jobs, jobs, jobs. We get to go to work with no clue of what happened at the expense of Japanese-Korean relations, let alone America's problem in the room. And I don't mean to be, you know, negative at the outset, but we have a comment in the chat room from Hawaii, and that I really, really think speaks to what's happened this week, last 10 days, which is an absolute catastrophe on the island of Maui. And I introduced that equally up front because there may be up to 1,500 people dead in a wildfire in Maui. Why does that relate to what we're talking about today? Because among the United States' largest Indo-Pacific bases is Pearl Harbor. Nobody showed up to save lives. And so I don't even know what Indo-Pacific means as a term. And children, elderly, were left to die by the United States. And that's our own. So we can talk about history. We can, I mean, please, anybody can ask questions about what was left out of the summit. I am just personally so grief-stricken for the lives lost in the middle of the Pacific Ocean that were easily savable, which shows us what the Indo-Pacific strategy means. Nobody cares. And we saw with both President Yoon's pleasant words about, there was nothing about Korea and Japan. It was all about what he wanted to do to make himself look good to the United States. Okay, fine. And then there was Prime Minister Kishida. There was no aggression in Asia. Okay, but apparently Japan was only a victim. So all of this is a strategy. And Simone, thank you for sharing your colleague's excellent expression, a mini-me NATO summit. That I think is the only thing we all need to take away from tonight, because nothing happened today. Most Americans will not even know this event happened. The rest of the world won't know that this event happened, and yet major military agreements were signed. I will say, as the perspective of somebody who I'm a sailor, you spend time on the water. Yeah, okay, information sharing is a good thing. So if that's the only thing this is about, great. It's not. Japan and the US signed a deal for new weapon systems that contradict the Japanese Constitution. And these are proactive attack weapon systems. So if today is about target China, it's a really bad idea, because the United States could not even save its own people in the town of Lahaina, Maui. And I guess that's how I look at the Indo-Pacific strategy right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexis. And I think especially for your, I also initiated this webinar because knowing that there's not going to be any coverage, or that we're going to be drawn by this sort of self-congratulatory propaganda on this very dangerous new military alliance. And I think that because of your such an important work on finding historical truth and justice, it is truly appalling. Even 3 days before the summit, Kishida, and he sent his respectful offering to the Yasukuni, where the famous Japanese, war criminals are buried. And
yes.
So I think during Q&A, maybe we can also probably will be some question about your thoughts on how this complete neglect or disregard of the historical justice. So maybe next we can go to Tim Shorrock, who has been, in fact, I would say that on this issue, he is, if not the only one, he is the best journalist and also analyst on this particular issue, Japan-US-Korea Trilateral Alliance. And so in fact, I wanted to say that Tim's Twitter is, I almost want to say our official Twitter for the webinar. But anyway, without further ado, let's go to Tim. Thank you, Tim, for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Simone, for hosting us, and thank you everybody who worked on this. And thanks to Alexis, who helped me sort of figure out myself as what I call a humanitarian journalist. She held a conference one time on humanitarianism and invited me as the only journalist who was there, and it really helped me rethink my whole work and career. And it was a really important event for me. And I really, her take on the world is really important. And what she just said was extremely important, because to me, what's astonishing is the volume of disinformation and misinformation you get. I mean, I've been watching all this afternoon and in the last couple of days, and it's just an astonishing, offensive by the Washington Post and the New York Times and their editorial pages, all their little CIA people and think tank people on their editorial pages, this combined offensive to make people believe that this is some kind of great event, and that Biden is some kind of great statesman, and Yoon is some kind of great statesman, and so is Kishida. It's really kind of sickening and alarming at the same time how reporters are just spewing government line. It's like we've never learned anything from Vietnam or anything. It's just really astonishing to me. But anyway, I want to just start by just picking up a little bit from what I learned today. First of all, I want to say that, back in July, I wrote an article on my website, and the headline is about 70 years after the armistice and the end of the Korean War. And the headline was, the U.S. introduces a new trilateral alliance with South Korea and Japan that could keep U.S. troops in Asia forever. And I want to say that today, according to the New York Times, the three leaders, Mr. Biden said he and his colleagues agreed to hold annual military exercises and hold trilateral meetings each year to deepen their alliance, quote, not just this year, not just next year, but forever. So you read it first on my page. I mean, what they're talking about is a massive change, because it's like, the Korean War ended and there was an armistice, but the war, as we know, keeps going. But there was always, discussions between North and South Korea about unifying and ending the war. Those have permanently ended now. And it's now, South Korea is now allied with Japan and the US against North Korea. And that's really a fundamental shift in my view that the US is trying to push. It's really important to me to understand this from what's in Biden's mind and what he's been told by his aides, Blinken, particularly, and Kurt Campbell, who is the Asia czar, who's been running this Asia policy basically since Obama, and came up with the whole term Asian pivot. Because, Biden's this new trilateral alliance, which they don't really want to call an alliance, but by all means, by every definition it is. An attack on one partner could automatically involve all three. And that's why they're having these annual military exercises starting this year. They've already had trilateral military exercises. But what this means to the US, and I've documented this in some of the articles I've done by looking at statements that US officials have made over the last 10 years, is that it means Japanese troops could someday be involved again on the Korean Peninsula. There is, a collapse of North Korea, these different kind of scenarios that work out. Now, if there's a war, all three parties are affected. So that means Japan would be involved. And as Alexis said, they passed these laws which circumvent their constitution to allow attacks on enemy bases for the first time since World War II. This is a recent change in Japan that Biden has also taken credit for. And so it means that, they could be involved in the Korean Peninsula, which to me is a completely insane idea. And that's totally anathema to Koreans. I mean, you can ask people around South Korea, they'll say, if Japanese troops come here, we'll fight them. I mean, it just runs against what happened for the last 100 years in US-Korea in Korea-Japan relations. So I think it's a very alarming thing. But as I've been writing, this has been the US plan for years and decades. One of the interesting things is the explanation is, this is new, because of the threat from China and the new belligerents from North Korea. They've decided to form this creative new trilateral alliance. That's the official line. But even Jake Sullivan today, and he gave this press briefing before the actual meeting, he said, this is Jake Sullivan talking to the media. Jake Sullivan is Biden's national security advisor. We've had a combined 150 years of alliance cooperation with Japan and Korea. So in that sense, the work that we are doing with these two countries is not new. What is new is that we are now stitching all of that work together to try to enhance regional stability and security. So he admits that this has been going on for a long time. And here's the sort of hidden history behind all of this. First of all, Washington, Democrats and Republicans, and the Pentagon has been encouraging Japanese rearmament and the merging of Japanese, Korean, South Korean strategic interests since the first years of the US military occupation of Southern Korea and Japan. You can find documents in the National Archives going back to 1947 of US officials saying, we ought to get, this is, just after the war ended, just after 35 years of bitter colonialism, American officials saying, we should get Japanese business people back here and Japanese, colonial officials, because South Korea can't run its economy. So that was the first idea. And then, of course, during the Korean War, a lot of people don't realize or understand that the war was fought from Japan, from US bases in Japan. The US bombed North Korea, strafed North Korea, killed millions of Koreans from US bases in Japan and Okinawa. And Japan was directly involved in the Korean War. And also the war revitalized Japan's economy. Its economy was moribund at that point. And this was the big boost to its post-war economy. They call it, in Japan, they call it the Korean War boom. And this is something that actually President Yun the other day bragged about this, reminded Koreans that there was this United Nations Command rear in Japan, all these US bases. He's proud of this. So, that's a fact that Japan has been involved in Korea, since the end of World War II, really, since the Korean War. But the US really began pressuring Korea and Japan to come together only after there was a military coup in 1961 in South Korea that brought to power General Park Chung-hee, who, of course, was trained by the Japanese imperial military during World War II in the colonial period. He took over with a bunch of other generals who had also been trained by the Japanese and did a military coup, took over the government. And within 4 years, under very strong US financial pressure, he had signed this normalization treaty with Japan, which brought Japanese capital into Japan in the form of war reparations and provided the first big capital boost to what's called, the miracle on the Han, the South Korean, huge export growth during the 70s and 80s and beyond. So that normalization treaty brought Japan capital back, brought Japanese corporations back. And that was, the US had been wanting that to happen because it was fighting in Vietnam and needed Japanese support for its, budding empire in East Asia. And so that's where this really began. That 1965 normalization treaty and how it came about is very important, to look at, because it's key to all of this. It's key to the disagreements that have happened between South Korea and Japan because of a lot of Korean claims that their relatives and families were exploited by Japanese corporations during World War II as slave labor. But so during the period, after the Cold War, after Vietnam, the U.S. began pressing Japan to take a much bigger role in its military structure and military operations. And there are several key events that happened. First of all, in 1969, the U.S. and Japan renewed their mutual security treaty agreement against massive protests in Japan. I was there for a lot of these. Those are the biggest protests I have ever seen in my life. I mean, literally millions of people shutting down the city of Tokyo, which is the biggest city in the world. Not just students, train conductors, workers, all kinds of people joined in these protests. But they renewed this treaty, which keeps U.S. bases in Japan indefinitely. And as part of that agreement in 1969, President Nixon and Sato, who was Abe's uncle, former Prime Minister Abe's uncle, they signed a joint communique saying Korea is essential to Japan's security. This was a new wording for Japan, Korea, and the United States. South Korea is essential to Japan's security. And it was after that the U.S. really began to sort of put more pressure on Japan to upgrade its military and to play more of a role with the whole U.S. military structure in East Asia. In 1978, the U.S. and Japan signed new rules that would allow Japanese maritime self-defense force ships to sail along with US Navy ships and things like this. The sort of gradual cutting back of what was meant by the peace constitution, essentially. And of course, all this is under LDP, a Liberal Democratic Party, which, as my father used to say, is neither a liberal or democratic. You know, it's basically created by people that had been part of the war, and right-wing anti-communists that joined them after the war and the Japanese government. You know, so this buildup of Japanese military has been going on for a long time. And then in 1979, after about 10 years of serious disruption between the US and South Korea over a number of issues, including Nixon's, withdrawals from Asia and his withdrawal of a division of US troops from South Korea, there's a lot of tension, and also over human rights. So a lot of American lawmakers and human rights groups here became very concerned about the Korean human rights situation. These tensions were militarily, anyway, were settled in 1979 under the Carter administration when they upgraded U.S.-South Korean military ties with Park Chung-hee, and they were upgraded like about 6 days before Park Chung-hee was assassinated in the largest public protests in Korea since 1960. But the U.S. relationship with South Korea was very tight after that. And that was one of the reasons I've written a lot about the Gwangju uprising in South Korea in 1980. But the U.S. and South Korea military were, very united at that point, and then this uprising in Gwangju disturbed that, and the U.S., helped the South Korean military put down a citizen uprising against military rule, against martial law in 1980. And that was kind of a turning point for a lot of Koreans in terms of, trusting the United States. But so I would say, like, during the Obama administration is when the U.S. made a big push to try to really create an alliance like the one they announced today. And that was under Obama. And, Blinken, all these people that are running Biden's foreign policy all worked for Biden and were key people in this administration. And, 2015, Alexis has written about this. The U.S., helped South Korea and Japan under a conservative government in Seoul and Park Geun-hye government. The Abe government in Japan, an agreement that was supposed to settle the comfort women issue. The women involved in the comfort women issue had no say in this agreement whatsoever, and they were completely left out. And it was rejected by Koreans. And when Moon Jae-in government came in, he rejected this agreement, and they said we're going to renegotiate it. And then the court case happened when Korean citizens were given the right by the Korean Constitutional Court to take measures in court against Japanese companies that had exploited forced labor during World War II. They were allowed to sue Japanese corporations. This was too much for Abe. Abe, basically imposed export controls, started an economic war with South Korea. And this is where all the recent tensions came out of this failed agreement by Blinken and Obama, and then its repercussions. And so, what happened recently in this year with Yoon, of course, Moon was very unpopular because his policies of engagement toward North Korea were not popular with the military-industrial complex, with the think tanks here in Washington. And Biden dismissed it as appeasement. And Biden, reputed the idea of meeting with North Korean leaders. And so, relations between North Korea and South Korea and the U.S. really deteriorated after the initial agreement with Trump. They were trying to negotiate an agreement. That collapsed in 2019. But after Moon left office, Yoon was elected president of South Korea. And Yoon is a very right-wing militarist, and he won by a very narrow margin, but he completely, altered the South Korean security policy. And of course, his agreement, he went to Japan, met with Kishida in Tokyo, hammered out this agreement on forced labor, in which Japan and its corporations were left off the hook completely. They don't pay a thing. It's all paid by South Korea. Now, imagine a situation like, say in Eastern Europe, where Jewish people oppressed by the Nazis, tried to get reparations from Germany, and they reached an agreement where Germany paid nothing, and the residents of the countries that suffered, of the countries that suffered, paid the reparations. It's a stupid agreement. It's not up to the victims to pay reparations for what happened to them. And this was, Biden and Blinken called this great diplomacy. It's all you heard all day today. These men are just such, they devoted to this great diplomacy and ending their disagreements. But, like Alexis was saying, Americans just are not informed about this at all. And that agreement, Yun and Kishida, that is the heart of this new alliance. It's based on their agreement. And my prediction is it ain't gonna last because too many South Koreans are opposed to this. And it's just, even within the government. So I think it's a very dangerous situation. And I'll end there.
I'm sorry, Jim, it's not my place to laugh right here. It will crumble like a house of cards because there is no there. And the problem is it affects lives of people. And it's just, thank you. I'm sorry. It's not my place, but you're right. It's not gonna, there wasn't anything announced today. Literally, what was the expression? A duty to inform.
Duty to inform.
Right. Okay. So that would, we could, and I don't mean to take away from Cathi, who's got Tim, thank you. And Simone, sorry to interrupt, but I kept watching all day. Is anything going to actually change? Nothing changed today at all. Because, and I had I define myself as centrist, if that's okay. I wish I were a true leftist. Really? I do. I don't have the courage, but I define myself as centrist. So I have the privilege of having a lot of people come to my classroom. Retired Admiral Scott Swift, former Admiral of the 7th Fleet, came to my classroom, as has Tim. Same classroom, same event last year, University of Connecticut. And Scott Swift told my students, the Indo-Pacific doesn't mean anything because they forgot the word Asia. And he really wished that Japan and South Korea could speak to one another because as a captain on a ship, when North Korea fires a missile, he wishes, again, and I'm not saying this as pro-American at all, I'm asking people to think about, okay, you're on a ship, North Korea fires a missile. The United States, until today, could not have Japan and South Korea convey the same information to the United States. So that is the only thing that happened today. All of a sudden,
I disagree with that a little bit because I actually think
disagree away. But it was like he was sitting on a ship, and he knew from South Korean intelligence that the missile was not going to hit anything, and Japan was going to do counteroffensives and yada yada yada. And he kept saying, oh my God, could I just possibly tell Japan? And so what I'm saying is, if there's a positive that happened today, okay, great. My child who is 18 years old and plays video games all day long, he could, my child could figure out where the missiles are coming from. But the United States military is not allowed to talk. Okay, so today, I think that was formalized, that 18-year-olds with video game capability are allowed to say, hey, wow, the missile's flying, go for it. And
Okay,
so
I think there might be a kind of interesting, actually,
I'm
matter
not
of,
disagreeing with anybody here.
yeah.
And Tim, I completely agree with you. This is just been a big bunch of nothing and an expensive bunch of nothing.
And so for that way, I think that's why I think it's especially also important for us to be informed. And I think what I really like about Tim's, I wish we had more time, is that Tim had basically elaborate genealogy of this so-called this trilateral alliance, which is not
Really well.
actually, it is nothing new. And from Tim's writing, prolific writing on it, one thing that really striking is that back in his latest piece, he says, this new trilateral alliance could keep US troops in Asia forever.
Right?
And I think that's something that we can actually probably we can discuss more about it, because it leads nicely to work that Cathi is doing right now, and to end Korean War, a peace agreement movement. And let's go to Cathi. Amazing work that you have been doing, especially just returned from this Korea Peace Network armistice event. So, okay, Cathi.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Tim, Alexis, and Simone. My name is Cathi Choi. I'm the Director of Policy and Organizing at Women Cross TMZ. I think Tim and Alexis have just given such great breakdowns of the context of what today means historically, and perhaps the disturbing invisibility of today. I should also note, just back when I wrote about Gwangju over a decade ago, I drew heavily from Tim's work. So I'm very honored to be on this discussion panel today. And just on the disturbing invisibility that I think Alexis and Tim have both noted, I think this is a great time to give a kind of grassroots report back from our activities from the past few weeks, and how we have been organizing. As has been shared, this might be seen as nothing new, and we have been mobilizing as a movement for decades. And so that I hope to give a little snippet of what we have done and what we can do in light of the disturbing announcements around this alliance today, so-called alliance. So first, as a brief intro in history, as I'm sure many of you know, in 2015, Women Cross DMZ organized a delegation of 30 international women peacemakers to cross the DMZ from North to South Korea to call for an end to this ongoing war. And then a few years later, in 2019, Women Cross DMZ joined forces with 3 other women's peace organizations, including a coalition of women's peace organizations in South Korea, to launch a global campaign called Korea Peace Now. On the 70th anniversary of the armistice, Women Cross DMZ, Korea Peace Now, alongside co-convener partner organizations, organized a national gathering in Washington, D.C. from July 26th through 28th. We had this 3-day mobilization with over 500 individuals across generations. I see some participants in the webinar here today, and of course, Tim joined us for this historic mobilization. We organized this with several other partner groups representing humanitarian aid, faith, veterans, anti-war, and Korean American communities. While in DC, we also engaged in legislative advocacy. We visited members of Congress at their offices to urge them to support HR 1369, the Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act. We met with State Department officials to urge them to lift the US travel ban to North Korea. As many of you know, since 2017, this draconian set of travel restrictions, commonly referred to as the travel ban, has prevented family reunions, humanitarian activities, the repatriation of service member remains, and key peace building initiatives. We also held a press conference in front of the Capitol building with Korea Peace Champion representatives Barbara Lee, Judy Chu, and Delia Ramirez, and many other activists, as you see pictured here. We also prioritized intergenerational healing We know that this war, 7 years and ongoing, can never truly end unless we take the time to recognize the mass grief and rage that stems from 70 plus years of ongoing warfare. So here are some images from the ceremony of Unbind Your Heart, where it was a grief transmutation ceremony, where we unearthed intergenerational trauma, untying knots of grief, as you see here, these fabric ties, released energy by dancing and singing together. And individuals also brought images and items that reminded them of their ancestors and loved ones and who they wanted to bring into this gathering and honor through peace advocacy. I think there's a consensus here among speakers and it may in this webinar that there's a disturbing invisibility of the Korean War and its lasting effects. And I think that the lack of announcement, and as Alexis mentioned, walking out her door, and perhaps no one is talking about this, is due to the lack of storytelling, the lack of presence of what this ongoing war and a military alliance like this means in terms of human costs. And especially for second generation Korean Americans like myself as Kyopo, we enter this work knowing we have to recover these lost histories and tune into collective grief and rage in order to continue the struggle for lasting peace. So we marched through 90-degree sweltering DC heat. We got caught in a rain shower, which Tim and I were just reflecting that stunningly, the timing of this rain shower started as soon as we turned the corner at the Lincoln Memorial. I think the photo isn't here, but you'll see it at the end. As soon as we turned the corner for the Lincoln Memorial, rounded around the reflecting pool, the rain showered on us. And then as soon as we got to where we were having our interfaith vigil, the rain stopped. And so very interesting timing, and things seemed to work out for us as we were there, aside from everyone being slightly over dehydrated from the brutal DC heat. You can also see the Baltimore Youth Percussion Group that led our march. It was just beautiful to have the youth be at the front of our marching group and playing these Korean traditional instruments. And one thing I want to share in one moment is that when the rain started, the drumming instructor asked the youth, stop playing because you're going to rip your drums if you keep playing. And one of the march attendees noticed that the children, some of them just, even though they weren't actually playing, were still moving their hands to the rhythm of the march. Just their bodies were just so in the movement and the procession. And I think that gives so much hope. At the Lincoln Memorial, after we finished marching, we held this interfaith vigil that included prayers and a powerful chant for peace. And we also rounded in a circle a dance, the Kangang Sule, which is a Korean traditional dance. And we did this on the National Mall. It was just a really historic event. We also rounded out our mobilization with panels of experts at George Washington University and included those with lived experience about the impact of the unresolved war and what's at stake. And you'll see here at the middle on the front row, Joy Gephardt spoke at our conference. And actually the whole conference is available online on YouTube at Women Across TMZ's channel. And her testimony especially showed what's at stake and why we need to urgently move towards peace. I think the conference also showed that there's a robust and growing consensus amongst experts from all disciplines and fields that the peace agreement is the essential first step towards normalizing relations between US and North Korea. Concurrently, activists in South Korea held protests in Seoul and at the demilitarized zone, the DMZ, calling for peace, diplomacy, and an end to US-South Korea military exercises. We at Women Across DMZ also participated in the International Symposium in Seoul, submitting statements to the Korea Peace Appeal Summit. These actions remind us that we are part of a vibrant, transnational, and intergenerational movement organizing for peace. And it is clear that the unresolved war and an alliance such as that is announced today, the root causes the root cause of tensions on the Korean Peninsula, resulting in extreme militarization, one that has kept Korea's people divided for decades. This trilateral so-called alliance will only exacerbate military tensions in the region, increase the risk of renewed conflict, and potentially catastrophic nuclear war. We see this worrisome ramp up in the installation of the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, also known as THAAD, missile systems in Seongju, and the docking of the Aegis destroyer on the naval base in Jeju Island. And this, we have to remember, this militarization comes at tremendous cost to the Korean people, such as villages being razed, ecosystems being destroyed, as well as toxic chemicals leaching into groundwater. And it's important to remember also that US citizens feel these effects as our near $1 trillion military budget deprives us of basic social services here at home. Further, this ongoing war also affects thousands of Korean Americans who are cut off from their family members in North Korea due to the draconian travel ban. So while this trilateral alliance purports to advance democracy, Washington's forced reconciliation between South Korea and Japan continues to undermine movements for justice and women's rights, especially as referred to earlier in this talks from both Tim and Alexis, with respect to the historic grievances of Korean workers who were forced into slave labor by the Japanese during World War II. Here, I'd like to uplift the efforts of US-based grassroots members who participated in the annual Global Day of Action for Comfort Women Survivors recently. Here are some images in Chicago, members from Kanwin, Hana Center, and others, and their action encouraged members of the public to sit in an empty chair beside Seonyeosang, Statue of Peace, to remember and honor the survivors of sexual violence at the hands of Japanese military during World War II. This so-called trilateral alliance ignores the demands of these activists and the survivors who are fighting for their due justice in the form of economic compensation and formal apology. Japan has never sincerely or comprehensively apologized for its crimes during World War II and has instead denied forcing women to work as sex slaves, rewritten textbooks to erase this shameful history, and waged a global campaign to take down so-called comfort women statues. Instead of fighting for justice for survivors and sowing seeds for peace in the region, this alliance is increasingly drawing Seoul into a new Cold War against Russia, China, North Korea. The deployment of the THAAD systems in South Korea, ostensibly aimed at China, has also heightened tensions between Seoul and Beijing. Washington has also enlisted Seoul in arming Ukraine with lethal weapons. And history will repeat itself unless we take action. A news story out in Boston Globe this past week reminds us of what many of us know, and I know Tim and others have covered, and as Tim has referred to in this talk, that purported alliances such as these have come at staggering human costs. And in the Vietnam War, South Korea sent nearly 400,000 troops to fight alongside US forces in Vietnam. And the effects of this mass deployment are felt across generations in South Korea, Vietnam, and extend to us here in the US, and me in Los Angeles, where I am currently based, as many veterans immigrated to Los Angeles as an extension of their combat under US military command and became shopkeepers that were then involved in the Los Angeles 1992 uprising. One of the mercenary soldiers from that time shared about serving in Vietnam, the blood money that we had to earn at the price of our lives fueled the modernization and development of South Korea. Owing to our contribution, the Republic of Korea, or at least the higher echelon of it, made a gigantic stride into the world market. Lives for sale, national mercenaries. This history and what we may be seeing unfold today is that a reminder that when nations war, it's everyday people who lose time and time again. So this is why we must build grassroots power. We must organize to replace the 1953 armistice with a formal peace agreement to officially end the war. Realizing that the US posed the main obstacle to peace in the Korean Peninsula, the Korea Peace Now campaign formed a US-based grassroots network in order to organize for change in US policy. Together, our grassroots network now encompasses hundreds of members in over a dozen chapters across the country. In our legislative advocacy efforts, we organize around the Peace on the Korea Peninsula Act, HR 1369. We use this bill to translate our grassroots energy into building political will, and we've seen major gains over the years. Over 10 years ago, we could only get 2 members of Congress to support peace with North Korea. And in the last Congress, we had nearly 50 co-sponsors of the Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act. And now with this latest reintroduction, we have over 30 co-sponsors, and we will continue to gather more. Every year we organize Advocacy Week, through which we organize constituents to meet with their congressional representatives to urge them to co-sponsor the Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act. And we use congressional advocacy not only as an organizing tool, but also to harness people power to force this issue with electeds. We also know that storytelling is a fight for our future. Here we see that examples of grassroots efforts to tell stories about the effect of the military bases on the environment in South Korea. We also have a presentation in the past from grassroots member Yoon Ra, who's the filmmaker, about Red Canary Song and intergenerational cultural organizing with their own grandfather based in South Korea. And I think, and also we have, of course, Crossings, which is the documentary made about Women Cross DMZ's 2015 crossing by filmmaker Diane Bourget-Lim, which is streaming on World Channel until August 21st. So this is the last weekend. I urge you all to look up on World Channel this free streaming of this amazing film that documents the 30 women peacemakers when they crossed the demilitarized zone. I think that this cultural organizing takes place against the backdrop of other manifestations of this type of alliance. So back in April, Netflix announced it planned to invest $2.5 billion into South Korean entertainment. And I think that this kind of trend of South Korean entertainment, hyper visibility, while the Korean War is the forgotten war. I don't know if folks know that Squid Game, the South Korean entertainment, is the most watched Netflix original programming. And yet Korean War is the forgotten war. When Alexis walks out her door, no one knows about this alliance being announced. I see a lot of the comments from people in the chat enraged about the invisibility. And I just think that there is something really important for us to know as organizers, as activists, and as storytellers and academics on this topic about what is being seen as what is becoming hyper visible from the Korean Peninsula and what is being invisibilized and hidden. At the policy level, our organization, we've written letters to the State Department urging them to lift the travel ban, along with partner organizations and activists across disciplines. And we've also released multiple reports. All of this is an effort to change the narrative, to make more visible what is happening in the Korean Peninsula in terms of sanctions, US-China tensions, the implications of a peace agreement. And we've seen direct results of our work. For example, as a result of the sanctions report pictured here, Tomas Ojea Quintana, the former UN Special Rapporteur on the human rights in the DPRK, called on governments to hear our movement and extol the benefits of a peace agreement. Finally, I want to end with noting that for grassroots networks members and for those in the US organizing to end this war, we inherit a long history of transnational organizing. And I want to emphasize the stakes of what our role is to play in this. Here we see on the left a group of international women who organized to visit the Korean Peninsula during the war. And I urge you all to watch Crossings, as mentioned before, which gets into this history. As US military forces engaged in air bombing campaigns, leveling entire cities across the north, President Truman announced considering using the atomic bomb. Park Chung-hye, the chair of the Korean Democratic Women's Union, and Korean feminist activist Ho Chung-suk asked the Women's International Democratic Federation to send representatives. Responding to this call, a group of 21 women arrived on the Korean Peninsula in 1951, and they wrote a report to the United Nations raising alarms about the devastation of the Korean War and publicized US atrocities. Diamond Kim represents another LA-based activist, an elder who navigated US, Japan, South, and North Korean government. He was a Korean independence activist organizing from Los Angeles for Korean independence from Japanese colonial rule, and then later on for Korean freedom from US military occupation. Diamond Kim fought against communist hunting all the way through the Supreme Court and taking his case and fighting for his rights in front of the congressional bodies of the US government. I think these histories show how important it is for international actors to use their voice in our relative positions of power while working in concert with activists on the peninsula. And so I want to end by just thanking you again for your time. And I think that this alliance announcement shows now more than ever how important it is that we continue to build grassroots power, continue to educate ourselves, continue to tell new stories. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cathi, for just the beautiful PowerPoint slides and all those faces that a lot of us that we are familiar with, and also amazing activist work. And I particularly liked also the Korea peace movement with this emerging new trilateralism. One of your main points, you mentioned that how the trilateral alliance between the US, South Korea, Japan will only, which I in fact took to mention in my introduction, exacerbate military tensions in the region and increase the risk of renewed conflict and potentially catastrophic nuclear war. And also you mentioned about Washington's forced reconciliation between South Korea and Japan is undermining movements for justice and women's rights. And especially with regard to the historical grievances that I think Alexis wrote so much. And I think we can now go to Q&A, and I'm sure you will have a lot of questions. One of actually, because just Cathi just gave her talk, maybe we can start with the Cathi first, and then we can also open up the questions for the audience as well. Cathi, because you're the youngest member in this panel, and we're basically looking at this is going to be, as we mentioned, it's an intergenerational movement, and I think it's really, it's important for young people to involve. And this Korean War outlasted everything: World War II, Cold War, and it's our lifetime. So in your view, what do you think? A lot of people are asking, asking for peace agreement, peace treaty now, and the Korea now. We haven't asked for really this for, as far as I see, if it's for more than 10 years, in fact, even when Korean were altered since 1953, and Americans, it seems to me, refused to give peace to. So the question that some of us has is that, based on this assumption, peace is not really a demand. I mean, it's not something that, make me feel as good. It's about concrete political settlement. So simply asking to Americans, even the members of Congress who, there's very few who support us, but still refusing. I wonder, what do you think, in your view, like the biggest obstacle at this point, and what are the concrete steps that all of us, in addition to this amazing movement that we started, and you are part of it?
Thank you for that question. I think my understanding is that it's the biggest obstacle to achieving what peace might be laying the groundwork for, which is the concrete steps, and then what we can do to achieve that. And I think that HR 1369, the Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act, as I mentioned, is a tool to start a conversation, both with your own electeds, and then also for Congress to message to the State Department that sectoral sanctions that are currently being posed on North Korea, that the ongoing state of war is not reflective of the will of the American public. I also think it's an educational tool. I think many of us during Advocacy Week, we are educating legislative aides about what is happening in Korea. We use this bill to describe the human costs of what the 70+ year war has done to, Koreans on the Korean Peninsula, Korean Americans here, and the general American public. And we are building political pressure by using this Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act. And so I think what the HR 1369 does is it calls for steps towards diplomacy, for checks for starting to have communications between the two nations, and to have the State Department write progress reports, and have some achievable action towards normalized diplomacy. So I think that in terms of, and then to your question of what folks can do, figure out first, as an organizer, you think what, and you can go to our website, you can figure out if your current representative, if you are in the United States, is a co-sponsor, and you can find members of your community that can help build power within your district to get your co-sponsor to realize that what the stakes are and why they need to support peace in Korea.
Mm-hmm. And also, I think it's amazing. And also, we also, you guys, all of us, also working with the Koreans in Korea, right? Those who are working for, regaining sovereignty and for unification and all that. So I think that it's really critical to serve as kind of a nexus bridge. And thanks so much for your insight. And I do see an excellent question from Richard here. He says, "What role does capitalist social relations play in recent developments and in the recent situation? Imperialism? Given that both U.S. Political parties are capitalist and imperialist, in other words, Republicans and Democrats, they are the same. They're pursuing imperialist policy or liberal imperialist policy. What are the prospects for and means to Korean unification?" I wonder if any of the speakers, or looks like I do see Tim's response here. Tim, do you want to address to that question? Would you?
Yeah, sure. Unification, the way people talk in Korea about unification is changing, always been changing. As time goes on, and young people forget about the Korean War and the division, a lot of people, it's a very vague idea. It used to be very, clear what people wanted, but not so much anymore. I was surprised when I was in South Korea in April. An old friend of mine from the 1980s who'd been very active in the democracy movement and been arrested many times. He said, we don't really want unification anymore. We want a free country, a free Korea, where people from North and South can travel to both sides and see their families, and keep the two systems intact, social systems intact. But we just want to be able to travel and have our own country free from foreign troops. And it doesn't necessarily have to be, unified under a single government. And I thought that was, quite interesting, because I hadn't heard that before. And there was other people that echoed that when I was there. And it's sort of a different way of thinking. But it's sort of like, we want an independent country back. It doesn't necessarily have to be formally, unified as one single government, but we want to be able to, see our relatives and go to North Korea and go to, visit and cross border. I just wanted to reply one bit to what Alexis raised at the very end of my talk, in terms of nothing has really changed. I understand from the military point of view how people want to have trilateral communication when a missile is coming from anywhere, or whatever, war is starting and you're with allies and you're fighting a common enemy. I think the problem is this might involve a prior, duty to inform means, Japan will be automatically involved in some kind of conflict on the Korean Peninsula. And to me, that is what's really unthinkable and dangerous. But it's in the minds of American officials. I wrote, I've traced some of these American intelligence people and military people, what they say in private in seminars at Brookings or CSIS. And they talk about, if there's a collapse in North Korea, they want to see Japan involved, tracking loose nukes or whatever. To me, it's a completely insane idea, but I think that's how American military strategists think. And so, it may not look that important, but it is. And I think it could be really significant. And that's why I don't think it's going to fit. I think it's not going to work, long term. And the other thing I want to say is that, this agreement today is a result of two things. One, Japan's military buildup and an agreement to have an offensive capability. That has been seen as critical by the US. Japan did that. LDP Japan did that. Second, Yun helped end this dispute, so-called, between Korea and Japan, so the US can have these trilateral negotiations. So Yun's sellout was a key part of this alliance agreement today. So it's all under US control. That's the thing. The US commander still commands Korean troops in times of war. This is a very unusual situation in the world today. South Korea is the only country that has a foreign general that would run its military at times of war. And second, I don't see how anyone in Japan can say it's a truly sovereign country when the US military has complete control over Japanese skies. I mean, there's articles in newspapers in the Asahi, every week or so about American military helicopters flying over Tokyo. No Japanese helicopter could do that, even in the military. US military has complete control over Tokyo skies. That cannot happen in our country. And I think we got to look at it from the point of view of the people who live in those countries, about the real implications of what this trilateral agreement and alliance could mean.
So Simone, I'm just going to jump in.
Sure, yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
First of all, Cathi, thank you for elucidating everybody so brilliantly and evocatively. Tim, I completely agree with you. 100%. There were Japanese troops in the Korean War wearing American military uniforms, right? Yeah, we've got documentary evidence of that, especially in what interests me, and forgive me, I don't mean to be really specific. I'm interested in the difference between water and land, because a lot of people who, like most of us, we live on land and we don't care what happens on the water. So the United States military was really clear. They knew they couldn't put Japanese people on Korean soil. So during the Korean War, they used them on the water.
Ships.
And so, and this is all Tessa Morris Suzuki, possibly the best historian of Northeast Asia ever, anywhere. She's, in Australia. Her work demonstrates this. We're immediately, the United States was like, I don't care who's who. Let's get them over there. We own the area. To your point, and to Cathy's point, the United States has occupied Japan since August 15th, September 2nd, if you want to get really particular, 1945 to the present. 78 years of occupation. And that is something that when Cathi says, go outside, tell Americans this, Americans do not understand. I don't describe Japan as the 53rd state. Should I? It certainly is a questionable state of independence. South Korea is far more independent than Japan in many respects, legally, militarily, and also in terms. And so when I say I'm a centrist, I'm saying, let's recognize what South Korea has done. And I'm not anti-North Korean. I'm also not pro-North Korean. I'm nothing. I'm an American with privilege sitting in my house in Connecticut right now, on formerly Pequot territory. So I just say this because I'm an imperialist by that definition. I know I am. Surely my family benefited from slavery because I'm white. So all of this baggage, most Americans, Cathy's like, walk out your door. I get to start teaching back at you. God, no, classes start in 2 weeks. I get 40 students in modern Korea. I get to say, so the United States divided Korea before the war. And that is the most important first step I have to teach. Koreans didn't divide Korea. The United States and Japan and Koreans divided Korea before the war. And that part, I think, is incumbent on all of us, is that Korea was divided before the Northern forces headed south on Yu-Gi-Oh! And we're dealing with that. My favorite professor in Tokyo, Wada Haruki, has, and I will happily share this maybe after the webinar, Simone could send the list. Wada Sensei wrote an article a few years ago about the San Francisco Treaty and how the San Francisco Treaty did not end war. It perpetuated a state of war centered on Korea. And he made this argument just before the pandemic began, and I'm sorry to invoke the pandemic, but I don't know, the pandemic was real. I didn't have a very good pandemic. Maybe you all did. I did not like the last 3 years. But in November 2019, Wada Sensei made a presentation in Seoul, very clearly said, the San Francisco Treaty divided Korea. And it was, it ostensibly ended war with Japan. Intellectually, what he's talking about is how it set the terms for what we are still confronting, which is why a peace treaty is essential. And why the State Department, why Washington is so afraid of peace, because Simone's initial question is, what does peace mean? It's not simply the absence of war. It is recognize this history happened. And that is what the United States is so afraid of, its own role in creating the perpetual state of war. Which
For
is
those who don't know, the San Francisco Treaty was signed during the Korean War by
September 8th,
It was
1951.
basically forced on Japan, and it kept U.S. troops in Japan.
I would not say forced. I would say, Yoshi, well, we won't go granular, because the LDP, the power that is still in power, loved it. They got Japan
Right.
back,
Definitely.
right? You get Japan back, but you don't have to say who owns Korea, because no Korean was allowed at the treaty signing. Sorry, this is now getting into history class, and nobody likes history class on a Friday night or a Saturday morning. Nobody does. Sorry, I know that as a teacher.
Alexis, would you agree with the those who argue that history problem will not go away as the way Kishida, Yoon, and Biden want? And what should we do? How should the historical issues, the addressing the military sex slaves of 200,000 underage girls and the forced labor, how should we address this issue right now? Now they said it's done.
No, thank you, Simone, so much, because today nothing happened. I mean, literally, that's the historical effect of today. Well, thank you. Here's what happened. You brought all of us together because of this was a huge historic announcement. Nothing happened today except for what has been happening. Lockheed Martin sold more weapons. Raytheon, I mean, exactly. Thank you. Love the thumbs down. But it's like, so more weapons deals got signed today. And, but nothing technically legally changed today. That's as a historian, that's the genius. It was empty air. And to me, the horrible part is it was empty air while there are real horror stories. And what we have learned from now, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, I think there are 7 Halmani still alive in South Korea. I mean, we're down to a very small number of survivors. And, but, Philippines, Indonesia, China, North Korea, we don't have information anymore. What has been astonishing for those of us who work with the survivors of sexual slavery is this isn't Korea versus Japan. This is an ongoing problem. And when we look at what's happening to Ukraine, right, we know this is happening to Ukrainian girls, boys, women. We have evidence of that. We know this is happening in Nigeria. We know this is happening. And that's where the survivors, especially the Halmani in South Korea, have been extremely, it was, of course, at the beginning, when Kim Hak-sun, August 14th, this week, International Comfort Women Day, when she made her testimony, that was extremely brave. She owned her name on television. At a time when that was unimaginable. Now she could, it's a different generation, right? Now you could do that. She owned her name and started the movement. Of course, people knew the history had happened. Of course, people knew the history of what the atrocities that had happened during the Japanese Empire. But you need somebody to stand up the same way in the United States. An African-American slave, an African needs to say, I am a man. And this goes on. You need a Native American. I am human. And Kim Hak-sun said, this is me. And she gave that movement the life that has connected to girls, boys who are entrapped in the trafficking of minors. And so that's where Japan is, as a government, really out of step with international norms and the UN. And it connects to what we're talking about. And Tim said, how much is the United States government going to continue to sweep under the rug? And fortunately, as citizens of the United States, South Korea, Japan, we all are able to have this webinar and not get arrested for saying what we're saying right now. We may not get the glorious jobs, we may not get the glorious publications. At the same time, we have the right to do this. And I thank you for that right, because we advocate with legal guarantees.
I think that's really true. That's a truly powerful statement and inspiring, and also, very empowering. And in fact, actually, I had a little bit fear when I was organizing this, because there's renewed this red baiting, McCarthyian attack on anybody who perceived to be critical of this new anti-China, new Cold War policy. And so I think that, to the extent we're not, not really, we don't enjoy as much freedom as we think in the United States. But that being said, though, I think it truly, we should have utilized it, and the tools that we.
None of us can be.
I just wanted to
be arrested for what you just said. That's important, right?
Yeah. So it's the importance of amplifying the voice, and especially, and I wanted to again go back to Cathi, to empower young people who are just might be entering the movement. I just want to make a quick sort of a summary about this Trilateral alliance, as far as based on some of the conversation that I had with my with colleagues and experts. For US, it's basically advantageous for US to strengthen this trilateral alliances. Although, as a footnote, I would say that an alliance itself is misleading, because it assumes that the parity of equal power, parity of power, all three, which is not. It is not at all equal. It is vertical. United States on top, and maybe Japan the second tier. Korea is at the bottom. So it's not really the alliance. So then question raises, what is it? Another is that Japan has, I think, somewhat more complex situation. But I think the most important thing already, I think he mentioned, it's about the revival of militarism. In fact, the country that is going to be lose the most is, in fact, Korea. That's why I wanted to have this webinar. It is the weakest link in this trilateral chain. So in that sense, I guess that's why, we really wanted to pay attention to how it's going to impact Korea and the Korean Peninsula. Now, I'd like to maybe ask among the speakers, any questions that you might have toward each other, or any other questions from the audience.
Thank you for the great panel. My name is Joseph E. I'm a professor at Hanyang University. Personally, I strongly oppose sanctions and support normalization of ties with North Korea and China. I also consider myself a bit of a centrist, and I talk to a lot of right-wing friends who say, well, if you normalize ties, doesn't that mean that you're ignoring human rights in China or North Korea? And so I'm wondering, to build a broad coalition, can we make the argument that we should think in terms of positive sum, right? So more economic and social ties with North Korea does not mean less discourse on human rights, okay? That the more ties we have with North Korea, we can actually, support human rights in North Korea and China. And so we should think in terms as a positive sum game, right? And then I might make the same argument with Japan that, Alexis mentioned that, the main thing from the Trilateral Summit was that there'd be more information exchange. And so before the summit, we didn't have information exchange, and Japan was one of the few countries that did not have a free trade agreement with South Korea. And so I'm wondering, again, can we make a positive sum argument that if you have a free trade agreement between Korea and Japan, more information exchange, that this can go hand in hand with, fighting for social justice, historical justice. And so I'm wondering how we can make a broad coalition to improve ties. So a broad coalition that can also include people who are concerned about the human rights situation in North Korea and China. Okay, thank you.
So I'm going to jump in and then punt to my colleagues. I'm going to say that the best person to answer the question is Dr. Key Park at Harvard. He is a professor of medicine. And prior to the pandemic, he had been in Pyongyang 19 times in 3 years, working on surgery. And when we talk about human rights, we talk about how to help people, right? Because human rights now is a term that is weaponized like every other term. We just heard that from President Yoon the other day. Apparently, those of us who are disguised as democracy activists and human rights activists are now communists. I disagree with that. Dr. Key Park is the most knowledgeable person about North Korea outside of North Korea. And I say that as an American citizen. It is so difficult to know what to do, right? Because, I can read outside information, but I can't know anything. Compared to, say, the 1980s, when human rights in Korea meant Amnesty International working for political prisoners in South Korea. And so that's the historical shift. We know that conditions are not good in North Korea. What do we do? Medicine is first. And Key Park is so interesting because he talks about the 3D printers that North Korean scientists are trying to build because they couldn't possibly afford to import, they couldn't possibly afford to buy an MRI machine, but they can build them. Right. And so when I say they, forgive me, that's not meant to sound as racist as that sounded. But the idea that American officials have that North Koreans are, just not smart enough to do anything because they're Korean, that informs American policy. And so I say that because COVID has hit North Korea really hard. Now we have another famine. And so, sorry to go on like this, but we need people who actually have been there with medical knowledge, with on the ground knowledge, and not just tourist knowledge. Sorry to say that, but again, Key Park, Harvard University, smartest person I've learned from.
I just will note, I just put in the chat, but for those on YouTube and maybe don't see the chat, Key Park presented at our George Washington University conference, Human Costs and Sectoral Sanctions, and you can find that online.
Thanks so much for that comment. Tim, do you want to respond to that? Tim, do you want to respond to?
Yeah, Cathi, what is the name of the Irish woman who was on Women Cross DMZ?
Oh,
Irish Nobel Prize. Yeah, I was there when Women Cross DMZ crossed into the South from the North in 2015. And they were barraged with questions about human rights in North Korea. And why didn't you denounce North Korea while you were there and this kind of thing. And, Molly, who is this Irish, she won the Nobel Peace Prize for helping build a peace in Ireland between, the British and the IRA. She said, when during the Irish War, during the Troubles, as they called them, there was terrible human rights violations on both sides, torture and imprisonment, and terrible things happened during that war. People were blown up. Members of the royal family were blown up. I mean, it was a terrible war. When there came peace, that ended. And the human rights violations de-escalated. And so, I think there obviously are things that can be done now in terms of, humanitarian issues like people starving or not enough food. But I think peace is the prerequisite to creating an environment where human rights can be respected. And, if North Korea could stop spending 90% or whatever it spends on its military and can spend more on, hospital supplies and surgeons and upgrading its medical system, that would be a great thing. And I think that we can look back in our own history in the last, 40 years. There have been times, Bill Clinton, to his credit, the Clinton administration, they negotiated an agreement with North Korea that almost led to their getting rid of their nuclear program. They stopped it for 8 years under the Clinton 94 agreement. And this required, negotiation, and Japan was involved, and South Korea was involved in building nuclear, in building electrical facilities in North Korea so they wouldn't have to build nuclear plutonium. But negotiations can work. President Bush came into power and denounced the agreement and refused to negotiate further with North Korea. When Clinton left office, they were on the verge of an agreement, not only to normalize relations, but North Korea would have ended its missile program if they had reached that agreement, and Bush, blew it out of the water. And, it's important to note that North Korea did not explode a nuclear device until Bush did that. And Bush put them on the axis of evil. So I think we can see in past, I think if Trump had gone through and had an agreement that was on the table when Kim Jong-un offered to shut down 80% of his nuclear facilities in return for the ending of some sanctions, and John Bolton and the hardliners around Trump refused to go along, and the thing collapsed. That might have been a way to move things forward. And so I think that what Women Cross DMZ is doing, to me, is just absolutely critical to push us away from always a military. Like this, all they talked about today is, they did some talk about civilian cooperation and so on, but it's all about militarism. It's all about expanding and making the militaries more powerful. Why don't we have different kind of relationships, based on human relationships and culture and real respect for each other instead of always military. So that's why I think the peace movement and what, Women Cross DMZ is doing, especially with youth, is so important. Get this idea that a lot of things can happen when you reach a point where you can actually have a peace agreement and a peace process.
Thank you so much, Tim. Cathi, do you want to respond? Yes.
Just a quick addendum is Marion McGuire, and thank you for mentioning that in the chat, Jenny, as well. And I also would just briefly want to add that in our sanctions report, we also discuss the effect of the sanctions on the health provisions in North Korea. But one thing that Dr. Park pointed out at the conference, which I've been thinking about since, is that North Korea has maintained 66 to 7%, I think is the number. And we'll have to look back at the exact lecture to get the number he mentioned, but it's around 6 to 7% of its GDP on healthcare spending throughout, which I think really challenges this narrative that North Korea will collapse, and that the programs, yes. So I see Alexis's reaction. And so I think, and that it provides so much of the foundation of this idea of, we will just, we'll not have no engagement. We have the travel ban. There's no people to people connection, and that there will just be a collapse. And I think that that's why we need to see a lifting of the travel ban, an ending of the sanctions. And sorry, I cut you off, but go ahead, Alexis. You seem very impatient.
No, I was just going to say, maybe this organization, and we should probably let everybody go, but maybe it should be Dr. Key Park for a Nobel Peace Prize. I mean that, right? I mean, when I say this, I have learned so much from him. We've never met in person. We met during the pandemic on Zoom. And when he explained to me that North Korean doctors could not afford, an MRI or a CT scan, whatever the machines are that we take for granted, that if we're in white privilege world, that you get your health insurance to pay for. And they've invented 3D printing versions, and we're thinking about exporting them to Africa. this is really kind of fascinating, right? Because an Africa, a poor African country cannot afford any of this technology. And North Korea has the scientific technological capability to build the machine. If it can build a nuclear weapon, it can build an MRI, right? So, but they build it for a fraction of the cost that something at Yale University would pay for its own machine. And I say that because that's what's not even known about North Korean capability. Outside of Korea, when I go into the classroom in 2 weeks, Korea means it's going to be highly racist. It's going to be all weapons all the time. It's going to be the Team America version. Then I will have to explain history. That's fine. That's what I do for a living. But the idea that, there is a reason North Korea has nuclear capability. And, and then I point out, if you look at the annual reports on which students around the world win math and science competitions, oh, wow, it happens to be, North Korea comes in second or third or first, depends on the year. So if you win the physics competition, you're probably going to be able to build a nuclear weapon, unlike, say, Australia, which the United States is now best friends with to build nuclear technology. And I say that because the racism that continues to guide American policy in Asia is one of our chief challenges.
Indeed, and also I think the most, my good colleague from New Zealand pointed out the Biden's Asia policymakers are not, do not have an important background in Asia or Asian descent, or mostly European.
They did really well.
That may be just, I think that we are kind of running a little bit over like 10 minutes or so. If there are no questions, maybe we can just wrap up here. And as you can see, this has been an incredible webinar, and for the depth of knowledge and expertise, and really, truly a plethora of issues that we discussed. And thank you so much, Alexis and Tim and Cathi, and thank you everybody for attending today's webinar. And we discussed a lot of issues, and one thing that I want to end is still going back to, for us, we need to demand this justice on historical wrongdoings and whitewashing the Japan's historical crimes of humanity is wrong, and trampling the rights of victims and those who have, as Alexis pointed out, have been courageously seeking justice, and our role models, who thought the true reconciliation is wrong, and resurrection, Japan's or America's resurrection of fascistic militarism of the past is wrong. And I personally think that this trilateralism will fail for many reasons, because it's a blatant historical denialism. It's a morally wrong. You cannot live, humans cannot live in the morally corrupt world. And one last thing I would like to add, my personal view, that is, it is truly important to oppose United States is the hegemonic quest and the imperialistic brinkmanship in Korea, and not only in Korea, but throughout the Asia Pacific region. So our peace movement must oppose the US imperial policy, and it's a focal point of its struggle, and support, especially I really wanted to plead that support South Koreans right now in Seoul, and who's mobilizing for candlelight protest for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks, as Alexis wrote about in the past as well. And they are campaigning to regain their sovereignty that has been lost for more than 7 decades. They are campaigning for independence they have not achieved. They are campaigning, they are mobilizing right now for their true liberation, right? True liberation. and finally end Korea's neo-colonization by the United States and regain the control of their destiny. So I thank you so much for your time and for your expertise and just the wonderful webinar. And I hope to see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simone, for organizing this. And thank you,
Yep.
everyone.